Hello and welcome to episode 90 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Linus.
Good to talk to you all again. So today we're going to talk about LLMs and development, large language models, or AI as some people call it. I think one of the first examples of this in development was GitHub's Copilot, but there are some other ones now from Amazon and the like. So let's start with your experiences of using them. How many of you have used them and how many of you use them regularly?
I've used Copilot pretty much since it was almost generally available. I don't know exactly how I got it, but I got it for free, and I still have it for free, and I've been using it pretty much every day since then. But I recently tried Codium from, I think the company is called Codium. It was trained on exclusively permissively licensed code. So it sort of, by doing that, it sort of sidesteps some of the copyright and ethical concerns with Copilot, but in my experience, it hasn't been great.
Like you, Amalith, I've also used Copilot probably since they publicly released it, not since before that. They offered a free tier for open source maintainers or open source projects, and I think that's probably how I got it. And I've used it pretty regularly since then, and it's been pretty excellent as a autocomplete.
Yes.
A fancy autocomplete.
Yes.
I haven't tried any of the other ones other than to say, like, I've played with your standard chat GPTs and Llama 2s and all those sorts of things as well. But day-to-day usage, I would say I get the most usage out of something like Copilot.
I'm not big on AI, and I used Copilot since December, I guess, since my current employer, they emailed and promoted a license for it, and I tried it out. My reasoning was for trying it out is if it's intrusive, I'll throw it away. If it's not, I might be able to live with it. And I've had mixed experiences with it.
Yeah, I'm not super big on the AI hype, so to speak, but I have found something like Copilot genuinely useful as, like I said, a fancy autocomplete, because it does do pretty well contextually where a normal autocomplete might fall over. This thing can actually look at my project structure and say, like, oh, you were writing an enumeration of something, and actually complete the parts that I wanted to type out. And like, it's really good at getting rid of boilerplate. And that's kind of where I let it stop, is getting rid of boilerplate for me. I don't really like to let it think for me, because I find too often it just hallucinates wildly with packages or functions that don't exist, or the code is just kind of slightly out of style from what I'm writing. But as a autocomplete, I found that it actually does help quite a bit.
On occasion, it really gets what I'm trying to do. Like, my greatest example is we had a string matching function which was not matching on the word, like delimited by the end or beginning of the string or spaces. It would like get a substring of a word. And I wrote a function for that, and I named it correctly, I guess, for Copilot. And it just got what I was doing and gave me exactly what I wanted. Whilst I feel often it gives me what I think looks right, but then when I give it like a second look, I realize it is missing a bit or something is slightly wrong.
Isn't that AI in a nutshell?
Actually, that's what scares me the most about some of these things, especially when it comes to coding assistants, is they're really good at spitting out things that look mostly correct or just look correct at a quick glance. And sometimes there are actual issues underlying what it put out. So that part does make me worry, because you can go really fast while using these things and actually put out functionally incorrect or unsound code.
Yeah, I found that. As I mentioned before, I think reviewing code isn't my greatest strength. And in Copilot's case, sometimes you end up actually having to review what it produces, and it might not have solved the problem or addressed it in a way that my mental model had decided to do it. And then you're essentially reading a very different solution for the same problem, and that can get uncomfortable. And there's one thing that annoys me with it is, like, because I edit in Vim and their Vim plugin was decent, but sometimes I'll want to autocomplete a variable name, and Vim knows what variables I have, but for some reason Copilot will suggest almost the right variable name, but not exactly the same, and that produces an error, and it just bugs me that I just use this variable 2 lines up. How could you not grasp that I wanted to retype the same thing?
It is funny how sometimes it'll do something almost brilliant or look at your project and put in a suggestion that you're like, wow, that fit perfectly. And that was, how did it guess that? That's amazing. And then just like you said, you'll put in what seems to be the most obvious next step and it just falls over entirely. So that's why I think it also, having used these things, lets you see what the left and right limits are and where they're really good and where they are not quite as good and don't quite meet the hype that's out there.
I think the quality of AI code assistance depends quite a lot on what kind of code you're writing and especially what language it's in. I've found that Copilot is great with Python and Go, but it's not quite as good with Ruby. Maybe that's because the shop I'm writing Ruby in doesn't write it in the way that Copilot expects, because there's a lot of ways to do one thing in Ruby. It's crazy.
Well, that's a really interesting point, that the language it's completing might determine. And I wonder if that has to do with the training data set that it used. If there just happens to be, I'm sure there's more Python than almost anything out there, but more than Ruby. Or if also, like you're saying, the expressiveness of Ruby makes it harder to complete something, that could potentially, I found that it does really well with Rust, but Rust is also a very boilerplate heavy language. It's very verbose and there's a lot of typing, which I think actually makes something like Copilot not only very useful because you get rid of that boilerplate, but it also makes it pretty easy for it to complete pretty large chunks.
And I think that's part of why it's so great with Go too. Go's very idiomatic. There's usually one best way to do something, or maybe one or two, and Copilot can usually pick up on that pretty quickly, in my experience.
Yeah, that's the same for Rust. I've been using it for C, and I don't think C has a one way to do things. However, I think there's a general accepted standard with C is that this is how we do things. And that I think Copilot does understand.
Have you found that it puts out anything, this is going to sound terrible coming from a Rust person, but that it puts out anything unsafe in C? Like it's doing anything that you would just eyeball and be like, yeah, that's not how we should do that?
No, not unsafe, but it can do some weird things, but not directly unsafe. But as I mentioned before, it will mess up variable names and things like that.
Well, I wonder if it could also not keep more of the project in its quote unquote brain. But that's one of the things that's hard with C or other languages, C++, is sometimes those interfaces when you're passing pointers back and forth, and you have to keep a lot of that in your head about who's freeing this and what does this point to. So I wonder if something like an LLM could actually do better than a human at realizing, almost kind of like static analysis, but with a little bit more probabilistic and guesswork involved than something like just straight up static analysis.
So are you all continuing to use Copilot then?
I'm definitely going to continue using Copilot. I think once whatever's giving me free access goes away, I'm probably going to start paying for it.
Huh.
I use it as long as my company or employer provides a license. It hasn't started to annoy me. It did for a while, but then I just changed its default key binding and then it was fine.
Yeah, I still use it, and I'll probably continue to use it as long as either I can or as long as my employer, whoever, doesn't have a problem with it, because some employers in the past have. But it's also not something that I would miss super dearly if I weren't allowed to use it. Probably a good snippet engine could do a lot of what I use it for. Maybe not all of it, but at least a good chunk.
Let me actually look at how much it costs before I let it stand that I would pay for it. I don't remember how much it costs.
I want to say it's in the order of $10 or $20 a month, somewhere in that range, but I could be wrong.
For individuals, Copilot is $10 a month. So at that, maybe I would not pay for it, but I haven't found anything else that's quite as good as Copilot yet.
Listen, you said you tried, what was it, Codium as well?
Yes.
What was the issue with that one? Were the suggestions not as good, or?
I think Codium could be a great experience if I used VS Code. Their integration with Emacs is just absolute crap, in my opinion. Its suggestions are exposed through some sort of completion framework in Emacs. If you use company, then it'll go through company. If you use a different completion framework, it'll go through that instead. In like any other IDE, when you start typing and it completes a variable name with the rest of the variable on like a one-line drop-down underneath, that's how it exposes the whole multi-line suggestion. And it expresses new lines as tab characters. And that just makes reading it a pain in the ass. If its suggestions were exposed more like Copilot, I think it would be a much more pleasant experience.
You've also used the Amazon one then?
No, I just looked into it. They don't support anything related to Emacs, so I don't use it yet.
That was the end of that then?
It was a non-starter, yeah.
Kevin, I think you mentioned ChatGPT. Like, have any of you used those kind of more general LLMs for code stuff?
I use it from time to time. I don't use it that often. Where I find it useful is when it's a problem kind of outside the context of whatever I'm working on, and it's pretty self-contained. A lot of times I get frustrated writing the actual prompt for it, and then having to massage that prompt left or right or get the exact wording is really frustrating, especially with these LLMs. The way you talk to them seems to determine the quality of the answer that they give you, and adding things like, please, my job depends on this, will actually improve the results.
Really?
Which I find silly and frustrating. Yes, absolutely. And it's very weird. Or prompting it with, I'll give you $100 if you answer this correctly. Like,
No way, really?
All kinds of weird things like that will give out wildly different results, as well as messing with things like temperatures and all those other settings. And I just find that too frustrating. A lot of times I'm concentrating on the problem I want to solve, or just something that I'm failing to Google at, and having to do all that sort of like prompt mess, I find frustrating.
I've generally found that ChatGPT isn't that useful for using its output directly, but more using that output to inspire me for something. Like, I was struggling to describe something for 2.5 admins, like how to summarize someone's email and the discussion that we had. So I put that email into ChatGPT and said, please summarize it. And then I didn't copy paste the output. I read the output and okay, right, yeah. That is the key thing, and that's the key thing. And then I reworded it myself. So I almost used it as an intermediary step. Is that something you can do with code, maybe?
Absolutely. Using it as sort of a jumping off point or just an idea. Sometimes the thing that it spits out or the way it generates the code might not be at all what I wanted to do, but it gives me an idea like, oh, okay, actually, yeah, we could loop through it this way or look at the data backwards or whatever. It absolutely gives good brainstorming ideas, so to speak.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. When you go through airport security, there's one line where the TSA agent checks your ID and another where a machine scans your bag. The same thing happens in enterprise security, but instead of passengers and luggage, it's end users and their devices. These days, most companies are pretty good at the first part of the equation, where they check user identity, but user devices can roll right through authentication without getting inspected at all. In fact, a huge percentage of companies allow unmanaged, untrusted devices to access their data. That means an employee can log in from a laptop that has its firewall turned off and hasn't been updated in 6 months. Or worse, that laptop might belong to a bad actor using employee credentials. Kolide finally solves the device trust problem. Kolide ensures that no device can log into your Okta-protected apps unless it passes your security checks. Plus, you can use Kolide on devices without MDM, like your Linux fleet, contractor devices, and every BYOD phone and laptop in your company. So support the show and go to kolide.com/LinuxDevTime to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/LinuxDevTime. So how do we think that this is changing the industry in the short term and potentially in the long term? Like, how is this going to change things?
I've seen so many different theories about how things are going to change, from like self-healing code that like really, really worries me to everything's going to be full of vulnerabilities left and right.
Yeah, separating out the hype and the noise from what's actually happening is moderately difficult right now. And I think the only way to do that is to actually use some of these things day to day to see what they're good at and what they're not. And that's where I get really curious. I hear a lot of companies that are peddling some wares and saying it's going to be able to write your test for you in your docs, and it's going to write all this, and then you're going to be out of a job, and it's going to be do all these things. I can't seem to get Copilot or any of the other LLMs to do that sort of thing. Like, even asking it to write tests, it writes almost the most basic tests, or ones that are not even really worth keeping sometimes. So while it can do that by the letter of the law, it doesn't actually do something useful in that realm yet. That's not to say it won't. And that's actually where I would like it to go. I would like it to write the docs. I would like it to write some of the tests that I'm missing. That would be great. But I don't think we're there yet. And I don't think we're anywhere near there yet.
But what has it changed so far? Like, it must have sped some people up at least and made people more productive.
I've got a very concrete example. I had a project for a client. I kind of goofed around leading up to the deadline.
No way.
Like I shouldn't have, but I did.
You never do that, Amalith.
No, not at all. But then the deadline was getting closer and I was starting to work on it more and more and getting nervous about meeting that deadline. They wanted it on Monday and it was Friday. I still had a lot of work to do. So I decided, okay, I'll just spend the whole weekend on it. And I sat at my kitchen table all Friday, all Saturday, all Sunday with me, my editor, and Copilot. And we met the deadline. And I don't think I would have met that deadline without an AI assistant.
It's funny that you refer to it as we. You're already anthropomorphizing it.
I know. I realized that, and then I corrected myself in the next sentence.
Something tells me, Amalith, when you were at school and you get homework on a Friday, you would never, ever do it on the Friday night and have the whole weekend just feeling free, would you? You'd always leave it till the Sunday night.
Yep.
And now with ChatGPT, you can.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to see just a continual speed up. That's what companies want you to put out more with less and work quicker. I think LLMs are going to allow us to do that to an extent. There will probably come a breaking point at some point in the future where we realize we're going too fast and need to slow back down due to some crazy CVs or something. Who knows? But I think it will generally allow us to continue to move forward at a quicker speed. I think also it'll allow us to move up the stack. Just like you hear often people are saying like, oh, it's going to take the jobs and developers won't have a job anymore. I think more or less what could end up happening is just like when modern compilers were introduced and you're no longer having to write like the actual opcodes and assembly, and compilers can kind of do that for you and you can focus at a higher level. I think we might be able to move more in that direction, just kind of move up a layer in the stack. So still developers. In fact, there might actually be more developers because it might open it up to a wider audience, but it'll just be at a higher level in the stack. And you'll still have people that are going to know all the assembly and opcodes and go all the way down, but that'll just become fewer and fewer people as we move forward. That's at least my guess.
So what about issues with copyright and the ethics of this whole thing? The idea that these LLMs are trained on code that isn't necessarily licensed appropriately. I mean, Kevin, you mentioned that some employers don't want you to use AI assistants when you're coding. Presumably that's why they're worried about the legal ramifications.
Yeah, that was exactly it. They were worried that whatever would be spit out would have to go through some sort of legal review and find out where it was generated from or what it was trained on. And this is also like kind of really close after Copilot was released. I think since then, there have been either several cases or other legal reviews. I'm not a lawyer, that have said that this is generally okay. Now, ethically and morally, I think there's definitely a question about how were these data sets trained? What were they trained on? What were the licenses involved? But at the same time, I think that cat is kind of out of the bag. And if I'm being moderately cynical, I would say that's also more human-like as well. I couldn't tell you what data sets my brain was trained on. It was probably trained on plenty of proprietary code bases and things that are not permissively licensed. And yet, when I write code, it's probably coming from some amalgamation of all of the things that I've seen and learned over the course of my life and career. So I would say that's probably the most human-like aspect of it.
No, surely everything you write is proper clean room, Kevin.
100% of it, yes.
I work in the automotive industry, so I mean, I don't directly interact with like the steering wheel or the brakes, but I have colleagues which do. And the company I work for, they were very concerned about traceability, who did what and why was this changed. All of this they're required to maintain in case there's a problem with the vehicle. They need to pinpoint why something works as has been implemented. So I was surprised that they actually started offering a Copilot license for developers.
I would imagine that that's the point of concern for them is at the point of commit, though, correct? Not the point of editing the code.
Exactly. I mean,
okay.
That was the instruction that you, the developer, are responsible for the code. This is not a replacement. This is an assistive tool. But it still surprised me a bit.
So even if it does turn out to be totally legal, what Microsoft have done with this, what about the ethical aspect of it? Don't you feel that you probably oughtn't to use it? I don't know.
Yeah. The legality aside, I don't like the idea that I'm potentially incorporating GPL code into my Apache 2 code base, for example. It's completely against the spirit of the license, even if it's not against the letter of the license. And that's what attracted me to Code Whisperer so much, because I don't know how they've accomplished it, but somehow they do have attribution in the suggestions. When you're writing code with Code Whisperer suggestions, it says this person wrote it. I think it says it's from this repository and under this license. And that would be awesome. I'd love to be able to just hit a switch and disable copyleft code, or copyleft based suggestions, I guess. And that's the same thing that attracted me to Codium. It wasn't even trained on copyleft code. It's all permissive. But at the end of the day, the only one I can really use is Copilot. And I think it's worth it, I guess.
I think where I've come to grips with this is when it spits out an exact copy paste of something else, that's where I start to feel a little bit icky.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't see that happen super often. And the amounts of code that, now granted, the code that it is suggesting, I'm not necessarily going to GitHub and search exactly where did this come from and is it a exact copy paste. However, the amounts of code that it's been suggesting or spitting out has been relatively small, to the point where I'm not asking it or trying to get it to put out something that would be unique and copyrightable in and of itself. I mean, there's only so many ways to do a for loop. So the actual suggestion itself, even if it were directly copy pasted, would have to be unique enough to be copyrightable, which I don't think most of the suggestions that have come out of it would be. Now, if there was a switch that I could flip and say, don't copy paste at all, I don't care how much alike the thing I asked for is, don't copy paste anything directly, I want you to come up with something new, I would definitely flip that switch.
Well, do let us know your experiences and thoughts on LLMs and coding. You can email us show@linuxdevtime.com. We better get out of here, though. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Linus.
See you later.